on today's StoryBeat.
I did this little film on Super 8, did a little character in it, and stuck on the projector. And the minute I turned that on, that little character that I drew turned around and looked at me. I was riveted. That was the singular moment of my life when that little character seemed to come alive. I had made life. I had created life.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Bill Kroyer, was nominated for an Academy Award for his short film, Technological Threat, the first film to combine 2D and computer-generated animated characters. He's perhaps best known for directing the popular animated film Ferngully, The Last Rainforest, as well as working on dozens of commercials and animated feature film credit sequences. He's also known for having developed the computer-generated Lightcycles in the original version of Disney's Tron. As senior animation director at Rhythm Hues Studios, Bill directed CG characters in films that have grossed over $1 billion worldwide. In 2017, he and his wife Sue were the first couple to receive the International Animation Society's prestigious June Foray Award. In addition to serving on multiple committees at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, Bill also served as the head of the Digital Arts Department at Dodge College of Film and Media Arts at Chapman University. Recently, Bill published his autobiography, Mr. In Between, My Life in the Middle of the Animation Revolution, which I've read and truly enjoyed, especially because I spent more than 2 decades writing screenplays in the animation industry. I highly recommend Mr. In Between to you. So for all those reasons and many more, I am deeply honored to have the extraordinarily talented, highly influential animator, animation director, and producer, Bill Kroyer, join me today. Bill, welcome to StoryBeat.
Thank you, Steve. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you here. So let's go back in time just a little bit. How old were you when you first started paying attention to moving images and storytelling and animation?
Well, I remember distinctly when I was 7 years old, my mom took me to see Sleeping Beauty downtown in Chicago. I remember sitting there, of course, loving the film because I love cartoons. But I remember for some reason it stands out in my mind. I remember looking at the screen and thinking, how does this happen?
Mm-hmm.
How can this be? I mean, these must be drawings, but there'd have to be so many of them that you can't tell. And I just dismissed that as being impossible, almost incomprehensible. I never thought about it. And then
So even as a little boy, you understood persistence of vision in some way.
I was aware of it, but I didn't. Of course, I didn't know the term at all. And like I said, it was funny how it dipped into my consciousness for that one time. I so distinctly remember it, and then I didn't really give it a lot of thought until I was a junior in college many years later, and I was in an advertising. I love drawing, and I drew all the time, and my dad wouldn't let me take drawing classes or art classes because being a factory guy. He didn't know anybody who drew for a living and thought that was silly and you'd never make your living at it. So he wouldn't let me do it. I
Mm-hmm.
drew on my own and I drew for the school paper. And so when I was at Northwestern University, I had to make a 30-second commercial for an advertising class. And I thought, why don't I make one of those drawing commercials? I make a cartoon commercial. So I, went to the bookstore. And at the time, the one book on animation was the Preston Blair book, Animation, that big yellow Walter Foster book. When I read that book and, oh, I get it. You draw one, you draw another one, take a picture. So I did this little film on Super 8 and did a little character in it and sent it to the drugstore and got the film back and stuck it on the projector. And the minute I turned that on, that little character that I drew turned around and looked at me. I was riveted. I got to tell you, I often describe that as being that was the singular moment of my life when that little character seemed to come alive. I had made life. I had created life.
And you did something extraordinary at that time, which was you were drawing, I assume, on paper, yes?
not only paper, but if you can remember back to the days of Super 8 cameras,
Yes.
you couldn't focus on something closer than like 2.5, 3 feet away. So the field of vision was about 24 inches wide. So I had to animate on butcher paper. I got this gigantic pad of butcher paper, and I was animating, and I'd flip it, and so these huge drawings. And I didn't have any pegs. I didn't know what pegs were. So I left it connected to the paper. I just folded it back. I mean, it was the craziest thing when you think about
Well, explain for the listeners who would absolutely have no idea what pegs are. What were pegs?
it. Well, a century ago, when people just started to animate, they realized that to keep every drawing registered to the drawing that came after it, you needed to have some way to hold that paper in place. And so somebody came up with the idea of punching holes in the paper and fitting them onto pegs. And that was where the whole idea came from. And that's been used ever since. There's been the different designs in the arrays of pegs, but generally the dash dot dash system that was developed by Bray back in 1918 has been the one that people have used. And that's what you do. I found that out pretty quickly. I mean, when I got into animation, after I did that first film, I realized, well, that's how you got to do it. And then I did two things. I managed to make myself a little peg bar, and I also got a camera that could focus tighter, so I could draw on regular sized paper.
So you learned animation by yourself. You didn't go to school for it.
Completely self taught. I knew no one in Chicago that did animation. I'd never met anyone that did animation.
Wow.
I even
Wow.
worked my way through college in an ad agency. I got a job in the summers as a media analyst in an ad agency. So I was around, they were producing cartoon commercials. I never really, matter of fact, now that I think of it, I don't remember our agency actually doing any cartoon commercials. I would have sparked to that right away. I never really thought of that. But anyway, the long and short of it was I remember after I started animating on my own, I looked around in the phone book and I couldn't find any animation studios in Chicago. So I never did meet a single other person in animation until this momentous coincidence where Chuck Jones was invited to the Chicago Film Festival. So the first person I ever met was the most famous person in the world.
Couldn't be bigger. And was he kind to you?
He changed my life. He was such a great guy. I mean, he was like a lot of animators in those days. And he was at his guest at the film festival. I think he might have been one of the judges, and I met him, and I found out where he was staying, and I went to his hotel, and I brought my projector, and I said to him, I said, "Mr. Jones, I'm an animator. Can I show you one of my films?" And he let me in the room, and he said, "Sure." And can you imagine that happening today?
No.
And I go in and I put this thing, I show him this little 8-minute film I did, and he looked at the thing, and again, watched the whole thing, and it was really a bad film. And he looked at it, but he got thoughtful. He says, "Are you telling me you've done this all by yourself? You're self-taught?" I said, "Yeah." And he said to me the sentence that changed my whole life. He said, "I think you have talent. I think you could make it in Hollywood."
Wow.
And coming from Chuck, who else could have said that to me that I would have considered it to be a serious statement? Chuck,
Well, maybe Walt Disney.
yeah, the deceased Walt Disney. And so I said to my mom, I got to go to Hollywood. And I packed up my van and off I went, knowing no one but Chuck Jones. I drove all the way across the country. That's how my career started. So I really owe everything to Chuck.
Well, that's a pretty good person to owe everything to. I want to go back just half a step. You actually made that first little animated Super 8 movie and having no idea what it was going to turn out to look like.
Well, not only that, but my hand was in every third frame because I got to the point where I was clicking the cable release as I was flipping the pages, right? And as you know, there's so many pages to flip that I was impatient and I would click it before my hand was totally out of the shot. So the very first film I made had my hand flickering in the lower part of the frame for
Oh,
a third of the movie. I never did that again. Yeah, the second film I made sure that my hand was out of the shot when I clicked the cable release.
so you clearly have an amazing visual style. I've seen a bunch of your stuff, and you have a style that's, I think, fairly unique, though of course reminiscent of other things. Like when you work for Disney, when you did Ferngully, it has a reminiscence of other things. But your style is your style. Have you always thought visually that way? Even when you were a little kid, you were thinking visually.
Not only did I think visually because I just like to draw, and again, I was drawing completely intuitively, completely on talent. I never got any instruction that taught me anything about the principles of drawing. I never learned about shape or contour, or negative space, or any of that stuff. I was just drawing. But I remember I was also very, I guess, steeped in an innate sense of story because not only did I love watching movies, but I loved playing with army men. I had huge amounts of little plastic army men that I would set up in battle scenes, and I would do a whole movie. I'd imagine this patrol going here and being driven back and doing that, and this guy doing that. I was constantly, like, in a way, making my own movies. Kind of like you see Spielberg, and when he made his movie,
Right.
his bio movie, it was really like that. I was always doing that. I always had this a draw toward the fantasy world of characters, and so that was also just kind of an innate draw in my mind.
So, were you when you were drawing as a kid, were you drawing cartoonish art, or were you drawing more realistic?
More realistic. I was drawing James Bond. I was drawing the Green Bay Packers. I was drawing, battle scenes of B-52 bombers bombing cities and things. I was just drawing mostly off the things off television. I was just
Hmm.
like that. I don't remember ever doing any life drawing where I actually drew from life. I didn't really do that. I usually would be copying pictures I saw, or I'd be watching things off television, and that's what my little sketchbook from when I was a little kid has all those kind of things in it.
That's you still have that sketchbook, I
Do,
assume.
yeah. And matter of fact, when I married my wife, who was from Wisconsin, and they were so terrified that I was a Bear fan, I said, I was a Cub fan. I never liked the Bears. I liked the Packers. That was the Lombardi era and I get out my little sketchbook and said, look at this. I got pictures of the Green Bay Power Sweep. So they accepted me.
Well, unfortunately, I'm a Steelers fan, or fortunately, either way you want to look at it.
The other great fan base, by the way.
Extraordinary fan base. Very well traveled. They go everywhere. What I'm interested in is how you got to, for lack of a better word, the whimsy in your style. You've done a lot of stuff that has tremendous whimsy in it. Where'd that come from?
That's. I think animators have always been blessed with the a lack of a need to grow up. You're allowed
So true.
you're allowed to be kid-like and silly, and so many of my friends are like that to this day. And I guess I was naturally kind of like that, and it just naturally seeped into what I enjoyed doing. I never
Hmm.
enjoyed literalness. I always enjoyed having something that was a little more fun and a little more stylized, and so that was kind of a natural inclination for me.
Were you a very humorous kid? Were you a funny guy?
Well, I like to think I was, but I had no audience. My family was very hardly anybody laughed very much. I don't know what it was. Life wasn't that easy. My parents, we didn't have a lot of money, and I remember my dad was a pretty, serious guy. When he was with his friends, he was a pretty funny guy, but not around us. And my mom was, again, a wonderful person, but hardworking, housewife. And then she went off when I was beginning high school to work because we didn't have enough money to pay for my sister's wedding. So anyway, nobody ever really laughed at any of my stories ever. And as a matter of fact, when I went to college, it was a really big deal for me because moving out of the house and into a dorm with other funny, smart people was a big moment. That was a big coming out for me and my personality.
Did it absolutely explode? Did you become the funny guy?
I don't think I've ever been the funny guy.
Just in the work that you turn out.
I have a mild wit, but I mean, as far as somebody who brings people into tears, there's only one person in the world that I do that to, and I married her. And
That's a good
many
thing.
people will tell you that that's exactly why I married her because when I met Sue, she was the opposite of me. She was absolutely the life of the party. She laughs all the time. She's super joyous. And one of the very first dates that I went on with her, with my oldest friend, I told a story and Sue she laughed so hard she put her head back and she was laughing. And I look across the table and he's just looking at her and looking at me and looking at her. And he just shakes his head and goes, yep, that's the girl he's going to marry because she laughs at his jokes. And that was true.
And it's lasted a long time, hasn't it?
45 years, 46
Yeah.
years. Yep. Still happy, still laughing.
So you were at the ground floor of going from hand-drawn animation into computer graphics. I mean, you were on the ground floor. Where did you learn about computers and how to do all that?
Completely by accident. And when my wife made me write this book, when I retired, and she said, you have so many stories, you should really write them down now before you forget them. As I started to assemble my string of stories, I came to realize as I stepped back and looked at the perspective of my life that I actually was occupying perhaps the most unique and fortuitous position in maybe this whole history of the transition of the art form. Because
Indeed.
I arrived in Hollywood when it was 100% hand drawing. There were no computers at all anywhere on the horizon. It was as it had been for the last 90 years. Well, actually about 75 years, I guess. And all the old guys were still around. Everybody was still, almost everybody. Grim Natwick was alive, and you had, Walter Lantz and the Nine Old Men. Everything was in place. So I arrived to come of age and absorb animation as it had always been. And then by coincidence, I was right there as things started to be introduced and changed. And I realized that that was kind of an interesting story because not only was I there chronologically, but I ended up right in the middle of it creatively. Actually, being a person who not only absorbed these techniques, but invented some of them and used them all the way through. And it was not only a matter of checking off and observing how technology advanced, but having a chance to describe what that meant to an artist and how an artist reacted to and responded to this inexorable change that was coming into our business that was not going to be stopped.
Well, how did you learn it? I mean, you didn't go to school? Again, you didn't go to school. You were self-taught, I assume.
Totally self-taught. I learned it because I fumbled into Steven Lisberger. I was at Disney. I had gone through the Disney training program. I was animating on Fox and the Hound. We were finishing up Fox and the Hound. And Lisberger somehow talked his way onto the Disney lot. He comes on there to steal the artists. I just asked him this like a few months ago. I saw him in LA. I said, Steve, do you remember coming into our room? How did you get on the lot? And he goes, I don't remember that. And I said, you came into our room and you pitched me and John Musker and Brad Bird and Henry Selick, and you wanted us to quit. And at the time we were going to do Black Cauldron, and I could already tell I didn't like Black Cauldron. And I said, what the heck? I'm going to go with this guy, Steve Lisberger. So I left and went to Lisberger and did Animal Olympics, which was a total blast. And of course, as we're halfway through Animal Olympics, Steve says to me, I got an idea for a movie about a guy who gets sucked into a computer. And that was how the Tron became. And so, Tron, of course, was originally going to be a traditionally animated film. We were going to hand draw the thing and just backlight the characters using Codalit gels. That's what was the original animation test said, these glowing characters, hand animated. But then as we started doing this, it was like a bug turning on a bug light in a summer night. All of a sudden, all of these people and companies started to becoming attracted and hearing this word and calling up and saying, we can do computer animation at our company. We can make things with a computer. And we'd never seen anybody do that. And so Steve started saying, well, send us your sample reels. And they started sending sample reels, and they were ridiculously primitive. I mean, if you've ever seen those, you probably have. And you look at it and goes, well, we're going to make a feature film on the big screen using this technology. But bless his heart, Steve Lisberger, had this vision and this drive, and he sold it to Disney. And the movie he sold to them was not possible to make when we sold him the movie. You got to realize the tools we used to make the movie didn't exist the day we signed the deal to make the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Those were invented while we made the movie. And so there I am with zero computer experience, never touched a computer before. Who had? Except guys like Ed Catmull, And I got sucked into this thing. But the one thing I had two things. Number one, I had true animation chops, right? I could animate, but I could visualize in my head before I started animating, because that's, as you know, that's and you're doing 2D, you have to have that.
You call that mulling.
Well, I don't know if it's mulling, but a 2D animator can't just sit down and start drawing.
In your book, you describe that when you're a 2D animator, it's a good idea to step back and mull about the scene or the action prior to starting to draw.
A lot of the experienced animators said you should spend half your allotted time thinking about it. Because, again, it's so much work to actually do it, that to do it the wrong way or to go down the wrong path or to do something that you haven't thought about and you stumble, it's very difficult to be a successful animator and get things done. So you tend to think a lot, and you do lots of little thumbnails. You do lots of little scribbly designs, because no matter how good a visualizer you are, until the picture actually is made, you can't really analyze if it's working. That's one thing. That's why a storyboard artist is so incredibly powerful in Hollywood, and is to this day and will be, because most people, shockingly, most filmmakers can't really visualize. They can't really. They can say they say something, but it's kind of meaningless until you actually have a picture. So the animator in 2D would do these little thumbnails, and you pretty much know what you were going to do before you ever did it. And that became an absolutely essential, critical skill on Tron, because we had to know exactly what we were going to end up with before we even started, or we couldn't begin to get the tools from the computer company to make that scene. So I had that ability. And then I had, thankfully, a bit of a comfort with science and mathematics and everything. And, I wasn't in any way intimidated by that. I felt comfortable with it. And I had, I was able to do that strange and necessary conversion from numbers into pictures and numbers into motion. Because the computer didn't understand anything but numbers in those days.
So you had to actually program it.
I didn't actually type programming myself. I provided the programmers with all of the base information they needed to do it, with graphs and numbers and et cetera, et cetera. And then they went ahead and actually entered it. But I didn't actually program. When I got to digital productions, I was writing little scripts and things because we were having to do scripts. Because in those days, again, the animation tools were so primitive; they weren't like today. You actually had to write scripts to get things to move. So I did that.
So it's a completely different process than hand drawing. You're doing something that's requiring a certain amount of numerical inputs and so on. I'm talking about the early stuff. Today, not so much, but it's totally different. What were those huge differences?
Even today, it's completely different, because drawing is extremely. It's two things. It's very intuitive. You put that pencil down on the paper and you just kind of already feel what you're going to do. And secondly, it's immediate. You're touching the paper. There's no barrier whatsoever. The impulse to make a line happens almost unconsciously. I used to describe it as being in the zone. When you're sitting at an animation desk and you're flipping paper and you're drawing, you almost forget the world around you and you go into that world, and you're in that world making things happen. You literally go into a hypnotic state. There was famous stories about people walking into Bill Title's room when he was working on the demon in Fantasia and backing out of the room because they thought they were in the presence of the devil.
Oh,
He was so immersed in that character. And so hand drawing is immediate and it's very, sensitive. Whereas by nature, computer drawing completely separates you from the art. It's a remote control barrier that you have to go through, and the actions and the things you're going through have no relationship whatsoever to the image or the motion of the image. When you're typing or you're moving a mouse or you're doing any of those actions, they have no connection directly to what is happening on the screen. So the hand-drawn animator is a completely different animal from the computer animator. Not everybody could make that transition. Some people did it okay. Other people could not. They just could not ever make a thing move using those other tools. They couldn't do it.
as I recall, in the early 90s, there was still a lot of resistance to the transition to computers. In the animation world, there was still a lot of hand drawn stuff happening. And when I was at Disney, I know that there were lots of animators that were resisting it. They didn't want to really go through the process to learn it. Did you find that to be true?
Well, absolutely. It was, there was a great resistance because it's still not as good as drawing. It's still not as good as hand drawing. I mean, not only is there a magic, there's two things about hand drawing that you can't match. And one is, I guess, like I said, the individualism of the drawing. A person drawing is directly connected to what they're drawing, and there's nothing else there. There's no software required. There's no rigging required. There's nothing else. It's just them immediate. So the personality that you get into it, right, is much more individualistic and immediate. So the hand drawing animator has that going for them. It is the art of pure illusion. You can draw anything. You don't have to stop and think about whether it is real. Is this dimensionally correct? Is the character malleable? You don't have to worry about that. You can, if the audience, you can have the character's eyes come out of his head. You can have his nose floating away. You can bend him and squish him and you do anything you want with the drawing. There's no limitation. And if the audience will buy it, you've succeeded. That's not true at all in computer animation. In computer animation, you have to work like crazy to get any of that kind of supposedly intuitive distortion of an image. It's just not the same at all.
So, how do we get some of today's computer generated animated films that have life and personality? Is it is that a testament to the new kind of animator?
Here's the thing: is the illusion of life can be imparted to any object in any way. I mean, you can have the simplest thing. I mean, Chuck Jones did a movie called "A Dot in the Line" with a dot in the line.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all the matter of how you pull the audience into the story and into the character by making them understand what this character is attempting to do and rooting for them and being emotionally involved. So you can have what is you could technically call the most primitive and simplistic character or emotion, and it'll work. So as far as that goes, you can take any level of complexity of computer model or character, and as long as that character is moved with some kind of sense of artistry by the animator actor, you have a chance to do that. I mean, the example I use in my book, if you recall, but it's when SIGGRAPH had the electronic theater, they used to have these pre-show things, and one day they had a pre-show of this. These guys created a little caterpillar that was just 8 little square blocks connected together, and they didn't quote animate him at all. They just programmed it so he would crawl like a caterpillar. A caterpillar, he'd squinch up and go forward. And when he'd come to obstacles, they programmed him to move around the obstacles. The little guy would go around a wall or he'd climb over a stick. So the audience is watching this just 8 little squares. That's it. And it's crawling along and it comes to a staircase. And each step is progressively taller. And the little guy goes up the first step and people are cheering. Then he gets to the step and he's struggling so hard. And the whole audience is going, come on, make it, make it, make it. And he gets up that step and the audience explodes. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is 8 little squares? He has no face. He has no name. And yet the audience, they got involved. They understood what he was trying to do and they rooted for him. And so that's a good example of what I call the seduction of technology. Don't ever think that it's complexity or sophistication or all these other things that make a successful connection to the audience. It's not.
It's still emotion. It's gut stuff. It's visceral, which is what we sell. We sell passion. We don't sell technology.
I love the movie Flow that won the Oscar this year. I have people that didn't like it because they thought that the rendering on the characters was really bad, which it was. They didn't bother. There was super primitive, simplistic lighting and texturing. They finally did something that people haven't done in 30 years of computer animation. Every time somebody creates a new tool, instead of making what you did before faster and cheaper, they just make it more complicated.
Yeah.
Guys in Flow just said, no, we're not going to bother about doing all this complicated texturing and lighting. And we're just going to make these guys basically flat shaded and we don't care, And so they made a movie, for like $6 million with 8 to 20 people. But it completely connected with the audience because the animation acting was superb.
So it still has to begin with story, though, doesn't it?
Well, story is character and character is story. And that's you can't separate them, I mean, there's almost never a movie that will involve you that doesn't have something that involves a character.
Mm-hmm.
And when I taught story, at Chapman, I boiled it down to what I called the 4 noble truths. The first noble truth is, who is the character and what are they thinking and feeling? You have to start with that. If you're a storyteller, the very first thing you must know is, who is this character and what are they thinking at this moment and feeling? And then the second thing, if you're is, how do I show that? How do I get that across to the audience? And then the third thing was what I called change that captivates. I mean, things have to be changing to keep your attention, right? And they have to be doing so in a way that makes you want to watch. And the final thing was what I called progressive revelation. Was that every single movement, every single scene moves you forward and tells you something new about what the character's going through and what they're trying to achieve. And within that are the great the principles of story, which are what? Setting up a premise,
Mm-hmm.
understanding a conflict that gets in the way of that premise, watching the struggle, and having a resolution. I mean, those 4 steps are as old as the Greek tragedies, they're probably older than that. They have not changed. I don't think they'll ever change. And what is a little bit distressing is how you're not seeing those in a lot of modern student films.
No, because they're interested in the technology rather than in the heart. And I taught forever that humans are only interested in seeing other humans in conflict with other humans. Now that can be translated into a robot, as in Wall-E, or into some other technological thing, but it still has to feel human in some way. It has to be anthropomorphized. Otherwise, you're just drawing technology, which is might be interesting for a few seconds or a minute or two, but not over the course of a 90-minute or 2-hour story. Do you agree?
Yeah, you like there's that old principle. You enter the character through the character's desires. You understand what the character cares about, and you relate to it. It may not be the thing you care about. An example, I love that movie Sense and Sensibility, which is about these women in the middle of the Victorian era. They're nothing like me, like what they want. As a guy, 26, I could care less, but I completely connected to their desires and how
Mm-hmm.
tragic it was and how they were so frustrated to get what they wanted. And that's basically true when you have animal movies or anybody, or anybody in any situation. To connect to that character, believe it or not, Michael Eisner, there's a famous story where he was looking at a movie. I forget what the movie they had up, and it wasn't working. And he just turned to the animators and said, "I don't get it. Who's this guy? What does he want? Why can't he get it?" And they looked at each other and went, "Oh my God, that's story."
Storytelling. That's just
we
storytelling
we
101.
haven't gotten that across. We got this character doing all these complicated, beautiful things, but why? Who cares? I mean, we don't even know what they're going for.
That's what I'm getting at. You, as an animator, you have always needed to have a story of some kind first, not just pretty pictures that have no relationship to anything. It might be wonderful to watch for a little while, but people are going to get turned off quickly if it doesn't have some kind of connection.
You need that in every shot.
Mm-hmm.
Not just a movie or even a short film,
Every cell.
30-second commercial. Well, that's the every picture tells a story principle. It was the old days. We used to say that you could stop a good 2D movie like the Disney classics. You could stop it at any time. You could stop the frame at any time and look at the character, and you would understand what that character is thinking and feeling at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
We had that saying in the old days. There's no real in betweens. There's no in betweens really. Every picture should be conveying what's going on.
So that's the title of your book. What does Mr. In Between mean for those who don't know?
It's my clever double meaning metaphor.
Yes.
An in-betweener, for those who don't know, in the age of hand drawing, was the person who literally did the in-between drawings. You had the main animator, the key animator, the lead animator. You don't draw every drawing. There's 24 frames per second. In the old days of hand drawing, you would usually just do 12 drawings because if you shot each one twice, you'd still have enough change for the persistence of it. So generally, you would have to do 12 drawings for 1 second, and the lead animator would just do enough drawings to completely define the motion. Then they'd hand that over to the in-betweener, and they would in-between and supply those drawings in between. And that was how I started my career and how everybody started their career, doing in-betweens. But then as I looked at the subject of my book, I realized that the metaphor was simply that I literally was in between the two eras. I was between the era of hand drawing and the era of CG. So I was right in between once again, Mr. In Between.
Well, I think it was a very clever title. I got it right away, of course, but many people would not understand the in-betweening a part of being an animator because that's a specific thing to that art and industry. So, all right. So now you've also been at the ground floor of this revolution with computers. What today, since so much CG is animated into live action, what now defines what is an animated film versus a live action film? How do you make that distinction today?
Well, it's interesting because it's a tiny bit of backstory. When we decided to give the animated feature films an Oscar, they never had a category for it. We had to write a description of what an animated film was.
Mm-hmm,
We,
mm-hmm.
we had to decide what is animation. we very quickly realized it couldn't just be what it looked like, because we could already see down the pike you could make photoreal imagery that would be artificial. So we decided that it was the acting, the animation acting, that defined an animated film. I have since evolved out of that to say now that there's so many tools to impart motion into a character that to try to limit that to what we used to think was the traditional animator, that's over now. You can motion capture is legitimate. Image processing is legitimate. So for me personally, an animated film is quite simply a film where the characters are not real things. That's it.
So, for instance, The Lord of the Rings, which has a combination of motion capture animated characters, Gollum and so on, and obviously live real humans. Is that an animated film?
Well, for awards purposes, you have to count the percentage of characters on screen that are unreal compared to the actual live action people. The better example is Avatar, the Avatar movies, I guess, where it's overwhelmingly CG characters in the Avatar movies, right? James Cameron will not submit those as animated films because he doesn't want them to be viewed as animated films. He wants real Oscars, as they say. But to me, I'd have to say right now, you'd have to say they're animated because those Navi, they're not real. They're artificial things, and they're just things. They have no life. So the definition of animation is to give life to. That's literally the definition. So
But even though they're motion capture and it's actually the performance of a real life human that's then animated on top of it, is that how it works? It's on top of the live action?
well, this is exactly it. Is good luck trying to draw the line where the machine stops and the person begins, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
My movie Technological Threat, ironically, is the perfect statement for this. It's the threat of what we consider to be the traditional process and the traditional animator, the traditional character being replaced by computers and technology. And that's why I think the film, widely, and that still has relevance to this day, because that's still going on, and it will always go on. The tools that are being created by very creative people and are being applied by very creative people are such a mix of techniques that it has become impossible to say what is quote acceptable and not acceptable as animation. When you're creating, if you have a cartoon duck walking through a cartoon forest, there isn't a live action filmmaker in the world that's going to look at that and go, that's a live action movie. They're not going to do it. And the audience is not going to look at it and say, that's a live action. They're going to say, that's an animated movie. There's a cartoon duck. How did you make that cartoon duck walk? You could put on a mocap suit. You never have to do animation at all. You can film yourself walking, and the image processing will analyze the motion and put it on the rig. Once again, you've never touched it. But the end result is indistinguishable from if you sat there frame by frame and did what we used to call traditional keyframe animation. So it's now impossible to start defining which tools are fair and which tools are not fair. So for me personally, I just got to this point where I just said, well, if it's a dead thing and you're giving it life, you're animating.
Any way you look at it. But of course, now there are so many movies that have very real looking characters in them, real looking animals, not cartoony in any way. They look realistic. And sometimes it's very hard for an audience at this point to figure out that it isn't a real character. And it doesn't necessarily have to then speak or do something that's humanistic. It's just a lion with full mane, but it's not real. Is that animation or not?
I just said it's very simple. If it started out as a dead thing and
It's animation.
you imparted the illusion of life through motion, it's that simple. But of course, where does it get complicated? The actors branch. They almost gave a nomination to a CG animated character. I can't say who, but there was discussion. If the company had not revealed that this character was CG animated, look at Benjamin Button. If you watch Benjamin Button, would you have guessed that old Brad Pitt was a totally CG face and everything? You wouldn't have known that. It was so
No.
beautifully done. So if they had just made a whole movie about old Benjamin Button could have gotten an Oscar nomination, and he doesn't exist.
Well, they now take James Bond, for instance. They now take a stuntman and let him ride on a fast motorcycle, and then they put Daniel Craig's face on the stuntman's face.
Daniel Radcliffe should have got himself scanned when he was 12 years old. He could have been Harry Potter for the rest of his life.
Forever.
I mean, there are actually actors that are doing that, right? They're scanning themselves now. So they have preserved digital doubles of themselves so they can be themselves forever.
What do you think of the ethics of that? What if somebody then takes that computer digital world and just takes it and uses it? That becomes a legal matter, I guess, then, yes?
Well, not necessarily a legal matter. I mean, it all depends. I mean, look, we've been cheating the audiences and fooling them since the beginning of cinema. I mean, part of the whole deal of the illusion of fantasy cinema is you don't tell the audience how you're doing it. So I don't see why there's an obligation off the bat to start revealing all your secrets. Why do it? I mean, I can see, like I said, for awards purposes, I can see why that would be necessary. And maybe you want to blow the audience's mind by saying, "Ah ha ha! You didn't realize that was done that way." I don't know. I mean, look, it's always been this thing where the traditionalists don't want to move forward. They don't want to have new things. They don't want to be replaced. They don't want to.
Change is hard. Change is hard.
They think it's, this is terrible. We're losing our. We look at that argument all the time in the animation committee at the Academy. People fight. It's not really animation. Well, I go, well, I hate to tell you, but as a guy who drew on paper, the minute the computer came along, that wasn't animation either. I mean, we eliminated entire job descriptions. The assistant animator, the cleanup artist, the in-betweener, those all vanished with computers. Why? The computer did it all. And so the computer is already doing 90% of the work.
Well, let me take that a step further. What do you think of AI and the fact that you might not even need anybody working with the computer or a storyteller anymore?
Philosophically, it's identical to everything else. It's another tool coming down the pike. And like every tool that's ever come before it, it will enable you to do things in a different way. I don't believe there's any inherently evil technology. I think it's completely how you use it. And now you're going to have a chance for a paraplegic person like Stephen Hawking, as long as he has an idea for a movie, he can talk to the screen. And if he just does it enough, he'll be able to make a movie, and it'll be his movie. It'll be from his imagination and his mind. He doesn't have to have any skill anymore. He doesn't have any craft anymore. The computer's going to fill all that in. So how do you feel about that? Well, it all depends what you end up with, I suppose. My feeling is that the more an artist has true artistic skills and true artistic training, that will show up on the screen. That will become, if not visually obvious, it will be almost like subconsciously imparted into the entertainment that'll give you a feeling. Because remember, like we said all the way back at the beginning, it's all about getting the audience involved emotionally.
Absolutely.
And how do you get them involved emotionally? That's the art. There is no analytics. I mean, the whole history of the failure of sequels is a glowing testament to the fact that you can put everything together exactly the same way the second time, and it falls flat.
Except The Godfather Part 2.
There's done 3 or 4 good sequels,
Yes.
Judgment Day, but look at Wayne's World 2. Come on, give me a break. Have you ever seen Magic Town?
No.
Frank Capra made It's a Wonderful Life. The next year he made Magic Town, same cast, same cinematographer, same everything. You've never heard of it because it's completely boring. And so it's like, this is the thing. This is why it's art, right? This is why you hope you have talent. And I tell my students, unfortunately, I'm going to tell you this. Usually the people that work really hard are successful in some way, right? But the people that really become successful have talent, and it's a gift. You have something, you have a feeling, you have an impulse, you have an inclination, you have an imagination, and you just have a talent that people like. And that's why some people hold an audience and others don't, I mean,
Well, so let's talk about that a little bit. Your possibly your most famous work is Ferngully. Were you completely involved in the creation of the story before there was a story?
No, the story came to us as really a concept. In theory, this woman, Diana Young, had written these children's books called The Ferngully Mob in Australia. They had barely been published. They were really not really legitimate books, but her husband, who had been involved in Crocodile Dundee, had this idea to make them as an animated film, and he got this Peter Feynman, the director, behind it, and he sold the idea to this Australian company to finance it. So they came to Hollywood with this determination to make the Ferngully Mob, the story of fairies in the rainforest, as a movie. But there was literally nothing beyond that. There was the story. There was the character of Krista, and the character of Maggie, who is the older advisor, and the character of Hexus, who is the evil character. And there was really nothing else. And it was the same thing, make a character that you care about and you can understand what they want. And same with Zach and everything. And so we completely fabricated that out of our imaginations. It was an animation crew. We never had a screenplay, of course. There was never
There was no screenplay at all.
well, not until the story crew got done, and then with
Got it.
then Jim Cox was the writer, and he did write, but the working with Jim was exactly as we did the Disney thing at the time, where the writer worked with the story crew, and it was a back and forth, and Jim would supply basic structure, and then the story crew would come up with the ideas. Jim would refine dialogue. Then Jim would transcribe everything in the story reels onto a screenplay.
Were you working with a corkboard and doing traditional storyboarding where you're pinning up?
We had 4x8s. Yeah, we had thousands and thousands of. I still have a giant can of push pins downstairs that we called canapins. I still have that. 30 years later, I still have canapins.
Wow.
And
wow.
we pinned up, thousands of storyboards. We made a story reel. That's how you did it.
Well, that's how they did it forever that way. I mean, that's why they were called story men. There were no women writing stories.
Still the best way to make a movie. I mean, that's why animation movies are, without any competition, the most successful films ever made, because usually you've made the movie before you make the movie. You've refined it in the storyboard process, and you generally know whether you got a movie when you started it.
And this was true for Ferngully, yes?
Yeah, Ferngully was exactly the traditional thing. We storyboarded the whole thing. We had big story room, 4x8s on the walls, on rails, just like Disney, sitting around, pitching the story, changing everything, shooting it all as story reels. Exactly the traditional process, which is slowly.
So in your book, you describe Ferngully as building an airplane in flight. Explain for the listeners what you mean.
Well, these guys came to Hollywood to make this animated film, and they wanted a Disney-style, fully animated feature film. Well, guess what? In 1989, there was one animation studio in Hollywood, Disney, right? That was it. And they went to Disney, and Disney said, "What, are you kidding? We don't do outside work." And so they started looking around. What are we going to do? And then it turned out, of course, that they had hired Jim Cox already as the writer, because Jim had worked on several Disney films. Jim was married to Penny Finkelman Cox.
Okay.
Penny Finkelman Cox produced Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. We did the opening titles for Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. So not only did we know Penny, but she'd been to our studio and she'd seen the quality of our work. And she said, well, there is this one group. She said, they're small, but they do Disney quality. And they came over to our studio. We had 14 employees, and they looked at our work and they said, you guys do Disney? You said, yeah, we're all Disney people. And they said, well, we want you to make a feature. I said, a feature has like 200 people. They go, you just hire them. They thought, being live action guys, you put a crew together, just like a live action movie, right?
Uh-huh.
You just hire all these people, you get a crew together. They didn't understand how difficult it was. So that's why we say that, because when we signed the contract, we had 14 people working in, 4 rooms on Olive Avenue in Burbank. And we had to gear up to 180 people with desks and layout desks and projection room and story room and the millions of things you need to make a movie. And we had to do all that while we were making the movie. We made the movie in 2 years while we made a studio. Who's ever done that? People can't make a movie in 2 years if they go into a pipeline that's already created.
Exactly.
I think a lot of people don't realize what a miracle Ferngully was, that it was literally made on the fly. I mean, we literally were screwing desks together the day before we needed to draw on them,
Well, I've seen the movie 3 times, and I think it is exquisite in many ways. And it's very clever, and the animation is absolutely spectacular. And what you're saying is you were doing it literally as you were building the studio itself.
Yep, that's exactly it. We built the whole thing together and made one movie, and then we couldn't get another movie financed, and it all went away again. So it was a moment in time,
That sounds too Hollywood for me.
Look, anyone's career usually is ups and downs and defeats and victories, and the inability to keep my crew together to make another movie was one of the great tragedies and sadnesses of my life. It was the toughest time of my career when I had to admit, and ironically, we had almost created our own animal, because when they saw our movie do well, I think when we came out, we were the highest grossing film other than Disney ever at that time. All the studios started saying, well, wait a minute, this movie, The Lion King, we should get into this business. So all of a sudden, Fox and Sony and everybody started thinking we should have animation units in house. And so nobody wanted to finance an independent company. Don Bluth had to leave the country, as you recall.
Went to Ireland.
Went to Ireland. So anyway, the bad news was that we couldn't get a movie finance. But the good news was when those studios started to think about having an in-house place, they started thinking, well, who are the experienced people that can do it? And they looked at Sue and I and they went, well, the Kroyers, they're the ones. And so fortunately, they became a little bidding war among the studios for us. And we leveraged that, and Warner's gave us a phenomenal deal. And we went into Warner Brothers to attempt to create Warner Brothers feature animation, which then became another disaster.
So, you also did a ton of commercial work, commercials, advertising, correct?
Yeah, I will backtrack a little bit. You're kind of missing what may be my most famous thing, and that's the Tron Lightcycles.
Well, that's for sure, the Tron Lightcycles.
And that's if you're talking about story process, you have to look at that, because if there was ever an example of a movie where the storyboards were so critical to making the movie, I mean, not only did we have to storyboard in a way that completely defined what the imagery would look like, because the computers, they could only do what we told them, but we had a storyboard in a way that worked within the limitations of what we were told the computer could do. And so we had to invent scenes that would feel like they were fully realized without compromise, when in fact they were a complete compromise. You could only do this. You could only do this much. So you had to make it look like you intended to do that. And one of the first sequences, ironically, was the light cycle sequence, And the famous thing with the right angle turns and everything, it was so hard to find how to make a smooth turn at that time that we thought, let's just make them just turn.
Well, and that worked great.
It became like the trademark thing, it became this trademark thing. And it was a crazy thing. As far as the story of the storyboard, there was a point in the script where Flynn kills this other character, and it just said that he plays a game and he kills him, and there wasn't any game. And I invented that ring game. I just came up with that ring game. I just storyboarded it all out, figured it out. It's just all pencil drawings. It became not only part of the movie, it became part of the game itself when they released the arcade game. So the storyboard artist has a tremendous, tremendous power in the filmmaking world, because the storyboard artist starts out as the movie maker. You're the director, you're the designer, you're the cinematographer, you're doing literally everything. You're drawing the movie, just you. And if you do it well enough to convince the director, yeah, that's what I want, you basically had the power to make the movie.
So then what is the director's job if someone else is designing it all?
Well, of course, he finalizes it. Look, there's a million elements that have to then go in to make the scene work, and any one of them can make it a failure. So the whole job of the director is to make sure that all the final components, the design work, the costume designer, the lighting, the acting, of course, all that has to be executed in the way that makes the suggestion of the storyboard, finalized. And that's what the director does.
Okay, so tell the listeners who Ralph Eggleston was and why you compare him in the book to Da Vinci.
He was we met him when he was just out of CalArts. Sue worked with him on Brad Bird's Family Dog, and she immediately clicked with him on just a very personal level. They were almost like soulmates. They had exactly the same sense of humor and the same taste. And so when it came time to start Kroyer Films, Sue said, "We got to hire Ralph right away." So we brought him in right away. He's a phenomenal animator. So he came in as an animator, but then very quickly, he just started drawing pastel paintings to design the spots. He would just come up with little background should look like this, color should be like this. He just started designing for us. And so when it came time to do Ferngully, even though he was really young and he'd never done a film, we said, Ralph is the guy. He's just a genius. And so he proceeded to draw hundreds and hundreds, maybe even 1,000 of these small pastels that would define every single moment in Ferngully. He literally hand defined. And when you watch the movie, and after you've seen the new Blu-ray release, it's absolutely gorgeous. And that was one thing that was no one has ever said anything but the Ferngully is you remember what you want to say about the story or whatever. It's a gorgeous film, and it holds up so beautifully. And especially in the days of CG, where your backgrounds have to have certain literalness, the artistry of the backgrounds in Ferngully being paintings really almost jump out at you now. There's almost, it's so beautiful to watch them now. So Ralph proceeded to do that. And he was the first one to, he was such an, he knew everything. He studied everything. And of course, he brought back the color script, which, his William Cameron Menzies had done that on Gone with the Wind, and Ralph, being a great student of cinema, understood that. He brought that back. And then when it was over, we couldn't get that second film financed. John Lasseter called me up and he said, "Hey, can I hire Ralph?" So even Lasseter knew at the time that this young kid, this young 23-year-old kid, was something special. And I had no work for, and I said, "Thank you for calling. Yes, give Ralph a shot." He went up, he did Toy Story, and then he proceeds to do all these Pixar films, like the best films. This is the thing that I think needs to go down in history, is not only was he making incredible visions, and like, who could have done Inside Out? Who could have imagined the brain? But he was figuring out how to do that in the digital world. And a good writer has to come along and explain to people how insanely difficult that was. It's not a matter of copying a picture. I mean, the complexity of lighting and shading and doing all that in a digital environment is so complicated. And even space, framing for space. I mean, there's so many things that you can hardly imagine. And Ralph did all those things. So I don't think he ever did a bad drawing or a bad painting. I mean, everything he did was just, he did For the Birds, which is like the greatest short. So I have to say, I think I've worked with a couple of geniuses. I thought Mobius was a genius, but Ralph, how could you not compare him to Leonardo? He could draw and paint as well as Leonardo. I mean, he could invent as well as Leonardo. He knew as much about everything as, so in addition to being such a wonderful, wonderful person, I just think, he belongs at the top level of everybody's opinion about who's ever worked in the industry.
But like so many in the animation industry, he's basically not known to the general public.
Yeah, it's too bad. I mean, but animators, that's how many animators are, I mean, even the most famous animators of the old days were never known.
No.
Pete Docter just did that book about directing at Disney, which you may have looked at, and all those films, nobody even knows who directed them. They never even got any notice.
Well, they're famously, Walt in the early days, the only name on the movies was Walt Disney. So nobody knew everybody thought he did everything.
Yeah, I mean, Chuck Jones probably did the best of all the old guys at marketing himself, as the Mark Twain of animation, basically. But even today, I'm not sure the general public ever knows or cares. I don't think 1 in 5,000 moviegoers could name you the director of Flow. I mean, even after they saw it, I don't think they could tell you who it was. So, in a way, we all accepted that, because in the beginning, when you were animating in the beginning days, I never knew a single animator who did it for money. Not one. I never knew a single person whose desire was, I'm going to get a raise. I'm going to ride up the ladder. We never, in retrospect, we never talked about that. It was always, how's your scene? Look at your scene. You did an amazing thing here. Look at how you did this. It was all about the art. It was completely about the art. We were all completely passionate about animation. Nobody went into it expecting to have a big career. Because remember, in the 70s, the business was terrible. So you weren't going to make a lot of. I was making, $4 an hour. So I'm making, for 40 hours a week, I'm making 160 a week. That's it. And when I said Disney, I was making $187 an hour or a week rather, as $187 a week as an assistant. And who cared? You didn't care at all, because you were just into the art.
And you were learning from people who had been doing it a while, so there was something to that.
Well, it was funny, living here in Wisconsin. My wife the other day was mentioning that a friend of hers was bemoaning the fact that her daughter had married a guy whose parents were very wealthy, and they almost like didn't accept her, because in Wisconsin, that's the wealth that creates the status. And Sue looked at me, she said, "Isn't it amazing how in our careers wealth was meaningless? The people that we wanted to hang out with were the creative people. We didn't care if they were millionaires or they were paupers. If they were fun and creative and they could animate, that's who we hung out with." And that was the hierarchy. It was a hierarchy of talent. And I think to some degree, I like to think animation has kept that same thing, because you're never going to be famous as a person. So you don't have the curse of fame. Even the most famous animator can go to Disneyland or walk around and not be harassed. you know, Glenn Keane tells this famous story of taking his whole, like his family and some relatives to Disneyland, and he forgot his card. He forgot his Disney Silver Pass,
Right.
and they wouldn't let him in. And he had to pull out his credit card and pay like all this money to get everybody in because they didn't know who he was. And this is after he had done The Beast and after he had done, all these movies. And he was so depressed that he went and he sat on a bench, just depressed that he was a complete unknown and everybody was walking by him. And then, lo and behold, along comes the Beast, the costume of the Beast. And all these little kids run up and they're hugging the Beast and they're so excited. And Glenn just looks and he goes, I made that. I made that Beast. Those kids wouldn't be having that fun right now if it wasn't for me. And it cheered him up tremendously. And he remembered that's what it's all about.
Well, I believe that's what true artists are. They don't think about the money. It's about the art.
I think that's the opposite with, I personally have a prejudice against a lot of modern art, which I think is intellectual. And I think with people like that, it's all about the sell. I mean,
Well, that's true.
you draw a painting with just two red squares and you can sell for $1 million, to me, that's the sell. It's not the art. And animators are completely the opposite of that. Because one of the great things about animation was you couldn't BS anybody into making them think bad animation was good animation. Anybody in the audience could tell, it was bad animation. So we became a meritocracy, which is why there was no mental illness in animation and everything, because you weren't driven crazy by why did this person become a famous actor and I didn't, No, if you could animate well, you would work all the time and, and you would do well because you were a good animator. There wasn't some psycho thing about why did that guy get discovered at Schwab's and I'm still struggling, You didn't have that kind, and that's why there's the divorce rates in animation are way lower than in live action, because people are real, they know who they're marrying and they're not marrying some psycho. So
Tell the story from the book real quickly of how Roy Disney's boat Pie Wacket wound up in the opening of so many Disney movies.
that was purely Mike Gabriel. Mike Gabriel was one of the great director designers at Disney, and he was very close friends with Roy. He like all of us had a reverence for the older guys. We used to go. Mike and I used to go to lunch with some of those guys at Genio's restaurant, which is this Italian place in Burbank, and you just loved meeting and talking to the old guys. So Mike had a real reverence for that, and he appreciated that Roy Disney had really saved Disney animation. When they wanted to,
for sure,
and Catchbook wanted to shut down, Roy made it. He made it stay. There's countless wonderful stories about Roy, but anyway, when Roy passed, Mike wanted to do something, and so he kind of did that under the radar, because that you can do that. You can sneak the animators. A lot of times, even your producers are not really on top of what's going on, and you can get things done. And so Mike just passed it up and saying, "Oh, I think we need a boat there. I think it would be nice to have a boat in the river. That would make the, And he's just kind of like getting it in, and nobody says, "Well, what kind of boat? I'll take care of that. I'll design that boat." So he goes and he gets the blueprints for Powhatan, and he makes the modelers build the exact duplicate of Roy Disney's yacht, and he sticks it in there, and nobody ever knew, except animators.
Well, I love when stuff like that happens. I guess you could call it an Easter egg of sorts. It's
an Easter egg. It's a total Easter egg. Yeah,
that's a fantastic thing. Well, I've been having just the most fun conversation with Bill Kroyer for the last hour or so, and we're going to wind the show down a little bit. And I'm just wondering, you've just told us all these wonderful stories, and I'm wondering if there's a story you can share with us from your time in the business that's either weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or just plain funny.
Well, I don't know. I thought all of them were kind of funny, but I think
they are.
One of the funniest ones was that time that Julie Andrews came to visit our studio. And Julie Andrews, who doesn't love Julie Andrews? I was in love with her since Sound of Music, and she had an idea for an animated film. So she came to our studio while we were doing Ferngully, and I thought, well, so I'm going to give her a tour of the studio. So I'm taking her around, I'm introducing everybody, and I get to the desk of Tony Fucilli. Now, Tony Fucilli is one of the world's greatest animators, but he's become maybe the greatest character designer in the history. He did our character designs, and then he got stolen by Pixar with Ralph, and he did all the Pixar. He's still doing Brad Bird's designs. So here I got Tony, and he's behind his desk. We can't see him. And I say, Tony, come on out. I want you to meet somebody. And there's this, oh, I can't come out. I said, no, come on. You can take a break. Come on out. I can't come out. What is going on? So I go behind his, it was kind of a narrow cubicle. I sneak through and I look, and he's gaffer taped himself to the chair. And I'm looking down at what is going on here? And Julie Andrews follows me, and she looks down and she sees my artist gaffer taped to his chair. And she kind of looks at me like, what are you doing to your place? And then Tony says, well, I was missing my deadline, so Sue taped me to the chair.
And what did Julie Andrews think of that?
She sort of shook her head like, I guess animation is different. Yeah.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
And so, all right, last question for you today, Bill. You've shared with us a gigantic amount of advice along the way here, but I'm just wondering if you have a single solid piece of advice that you like to give to those who are starting out in the business, or maybe they're in just a little bit trying to get to that next level.
Well, it's really like a twofold thing. It's number one on the personal level, constantly really honestly and truly try to improve your craft. It takes a lot of hard work. That whole 10,000 drawing principle, even if you're not drawing, the principle is still there to be very good at anything, but especially animation, especially that artistry of learning the craft of imparting motion and life into an inanimate thing to make people believe in it. That takes a lot of learning and a lot of skill. And so try to work hard to be better at that, to the point where you yourself find satisfaction in your work. It's a tough thing to be dependent. You're always going to have critics that like you and hate you. And there's an old saying, you can't believe the good reviews if you don't believe the bad reviews. So, at the end of the day, you have to find satisfaction in your own work. That's the one thing I would say that's a timeless thing. And the other thing I would say now is you better start paying attention to what's happening in the technology of this industry. You can be outstripped and outflanked by people who know the tech better than you do, but the days of finding a brick and mortar studio that's going to hire you, pay you, and support you for a career are pretty much vanishing. And you may have to embrace the new way of doing that. You can reach an audience directly now, and maybe that's something to look at. So I would say, unfortunately, just being an artist is no longer enough. You got to be a bit of a self-salesman and a self-promoter, to some degree, or actualizer.
It helps to have some business sensibility, even though you're an artist.
Yeah, and awareness. Yes. So anyway, those are the two things I would say.
Well, Bill Kroyer, I am so very pleased that you've been on the show. And this has just been a lot of fun for me to hear all these wonderful stories. And I can't thank you enough for your time, your energy, and your wisdom, and for giving us all this great stuff for all these years.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's been a lot of fun. You really made me say some things I've never said before. So there you go.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great Story Beat episodes to you. Story Beat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.